King Zereth sat on his massive throne, his sharp silver eyes scanning the grand chamber of the Silurian High Court. The air shimmered with energy from the floating crystals that lit the room, but there was no warmth in their glow. The mighty Silurian dominion, once unshakable, was crumbling before his very eyes. Rebellions were breaking out in distant star systems. Trade routes had been ambushed by unseen enemies. And worst of all, the Tzaltor warlords were gathering their monstrous fleet, preparing to strike. The advisors surrounding the king whispered nervously, but none dared to speak aloud the truth. The Dominion was on the brink of collapse. It was no longer a question of power. The empire was vast, rich, and technologically superior. But it lacked something else, something unseen yet crucial. They needed a mind that could think beyond Silurian logic. They needed a leader who could outmaneuver an enemy that thrived on chaos. King Zereth turned his gaze to the ancient prophecy inscribed on the golden walls of the chamber. It was a riddle passed down for generations, one that only now seemed to make sense. The mind unchained, the spirit untamed, a warrior of dust shall mend the stars. A warrior of dust. The word struck him with the force of a solar storm. In all the galaxy, only one species was known as the children of dust: humans. The court erupted in outrage when the king spoke his decision. A human, a primitive, short-lived creature from the outer systems. It was madness, but Zereth's voice silenced them all. A Silurian king does not make idle decrees. We do not have the luxury of pride. We need the impossible, and only a human can deliver it. Yet the Silurians would never follow a human. That much was clear. There was only one way to make it work. The king stood and spoke words that would shake the stars. My daughters, the princesses of the Dominion, shall wed a human. The one who proves himself worthy shall rule beside them. A hush fell over the chamber, followed by an explosion of voices. The royal court was in turmoil, but the decision had been made. The three princesses, Silvera, the warrior, Zyra, the diplomat, and Veleth, the scientist, would be bound by duty to this strange outsider. Somewhere, light years away on a planet far from the royal halls of the Dominion, a human named Galen Voss was living in exile. He did not yet know that his destiny had just been written in the stars. Galen Voss sat on the edge of a rocky cliff, watching the twin suns of Sci-fi sink into the crimson sky. The air was dry, the wind carrying the scent of metal and dust. He had lived on this forsaken world for nearly 5 years, forgotten, discarded, and left to waste away in exile. Once, he had been a brilliant strategist in the Terran fleet, a man whose mind could predict enemy movements before they even knew their own plans. But in war, following orders mattered more than winning. Galen had disobeyed, saving thousands of soldiers at the cost of defying his superiors. His punishment had been swift: stripped of rank, cast out, and erased from history. Now he spent his days surviving in the wild, fighting off raiders and scavengers who thought an exiled man was easy prey. He had no purpose, no future, until the night the sky cracked open. A blinding light filled the horizon as a ship descended from the heavens. It was sleek, massive, and nothing like the clunky vessels of Earth. The ship hovered above him, its engines humming like a living creature. Then, before he could react, beams of blue light surrounded him. His body lifted off the ground, weightless, and the next thing he knew, he was gone. When Galen's vision cleared, he found himself inside a grand chamber of polished obsidian and glowing golden glyphs. Silurians, he had heard of them. An empire of powerful, long-lived beings who ruled a vast portion of the galaxy. But what did they want with him? Before he could demand answers, the chamber doors parted. A tall figure entered, his very presence commanding respect. King Zereth, his piercing silver eyes locked onto Galen like a predator studying its prey. Around the room, Silurian nobles stood in silence, watching the human with unreadable expressions. "You have been chosen," the king said, his deep voice echoing across the hall. chosen to wed my daughters and rule beside them. Galen blinked. Had he misheard? Marry. Rule? This had to be a joke. I think you have the wrong man, he scoffed, crossing his arms. The nobles murmured in offense, but Zareth remained still. You are exactly who we need, he said. The Xaltor warlords prepare for war. We require a mind capable of facing them. Our laws prevent an outsider from leading, unless he is bound to the royal bloodline. Galen let out a humorless laugh. So I'm a political tool. A weapon, the king corrected. One only humanity can forge. Galen's first instinct was to refuse. He wanted nothing to do with politics, royalty, or an empire that saw him as nothing more than a means to an end. But something in Zareth's eyes told him this wasn't just about strategy. This was survival. And for the first time in years, Galen saw something he hadn't in a long time. A challenge. Fine, he said, smirking. But I don't just marry my way into power. I earn it. The king's lips curled into the slightest hint of a smile. Then prove yourself. And just like that, the game had begun. Princess Silvera stood in the grand war hall, her arms crossed, eyes burning with defiance. The heavy air of the chamber crackled with tension as she glared at the human standing before her. Galen Voss. He was smaller than a Silurian warrior, his skin lacking the shimmering glow of her people, but there was something in his stance, something unshaken, unbent. She hated it. I refuse, Silvera said coldly. No human will be my husband. Beside her, Princess Zyra barely looked up from the holopad in her hand, her violet eyes scanning data reports. Father has made his decree, sister. Whether we like it or not, the human is here. Her voice was smooth, sharp, and calculating. On the other side of the hall, Princess Velith adjusted the crystalline lenses on her wrist device, her golden eyes filled with curiosity. Unlike her sisters, she wasn't disgusted. She was fascinated. I don't see why you're both so emotional about this. This is an opportunity to study an entirely new species up close. Imagine the biological data I could collect. She turned to Galen. How resistant is human skin to extreme temperatures? Galen smirked, shaking his head. Depends. You planning to throw me into a furnace or drop me on an ice planet? Velith's lips curled into a slight smile. Both, ideally. Silvera scowled. Enough of this. I will not be forced to stand beside a man who has never seen a real war, let alone fought one. She turned to Galen, stepping forward, her armored boots echoing in the chamber. You claim to be a warrior. Prove it. Face me in combat. Galen raised an eyebrow. You want me to fight you? Here. Now. Zyra sighed. This is unnecessary. Silvera ignored her. If I am to tolerate this ridiculous arrangement, I must know you are not weak. Galen chuckled, stretching his arms. Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. The hall cleared in seconds. The nobles who had been watching from the sidelines now formed a wide circle around them. A servant handed Galen a standard Silurian combat blade, lighter than a human sword, but balanced. He gave it a few testing swings. Silvera, on the other hand, wielded her own blade, forged from pure energy. Her stance was perfect, aggressive, precise. Then she attacked. Silvera moved faster than any human Galen had ever faced. She was a blur of silver and steel, her blade slicing through the air with deadly precision. He barely dodged the first strike, ducked the second, and deflected the third. She was strong, too strong. If he fought her head-on, he would lose. So he didn't. Instead, he did what humans did best, adapted. He dodged, sidestepped, forced her to overcome it. When she swung too hard, he was already gone, moving faster than she expected. He wasn't stronger, but he was smarter. And when she left an opening, just a fraction of a second, he acted. In one swift motion, he twisted her wrist, disarming her. The energy blade clattered to the floor. Silence filled the hall. Silvera stared at him, breathless, furious, impressed. Galen grinned. I believe I just proved myself. For the first time, the princesses saw Galen not as an outsider, but as something far more dangerous. And equal, Galen Voss stood in the center of the royal arena, surrounded by thousands of watching Silurians. The great dome chamber shimmered with golden light, the energy fields humming in the walls. This was not a place of entertainment. It was a proving ground. And today, he was the one being tested. King Xerath sat high on his throne. His expression, Galen Voss had proven himself. He had outdueled Silvera, outmaneuvered Axira, and outfought Velith. He had passed every trial, yet as he stood before the Silurian High Court, he could feel the tension in the air. The nobles who had watched him succeed were not cheering. They were seething. A human had bested their strongest warrior. A human had outwitted their greatest diplomat. A human had solved a problem even their brightest minds had struggled with. It was unacceptable. King Xerath sat tall on his throne, his silver eyes scanning the court. He had expected resistance, but even he had underestimated the depth of the hatred for outsiders. The Silurians were a proud race, rulers of countless star systems. The idea of a human standing beside their princesses, let alone sharing their throne, was an insult to many. One of the nobles, Lord Verith, stepped forward, his deep blue armor reflecting the golden lights of the chamber. Your Majesty, he said, his voice smooth but cold, this human has shown skill, but skill does not make one worthy of our throne. He is not one of us. He is not Silurian. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the court. Galen crossed his arms, unimpressed. He had seen this kind of arrogance before. Back in the Terran fleet, old admirals had dismissed new ideas simply because they came from younger officers. And just like then, he knew exactly how to handle it. I don't need to be Silurian, Galen said, stepping forward. I need to lead them. I need to win the war that's coming. Or would you rather let your pride destroy your empire? Lord Verith's eyes narrowed. You speak as if you are already king. But tell me, human, do you truly believe the people will follow you? Galen turned his gaze to the crowd. Hundreds of nobles, warriors, and scholars watched him, their faces unreadable. Some were furious, some were skeptical, and some, just a few, were curious. That was enough. The people don't need to love me, Galen said. They need to trust me. And trust is earned in battle, not in courtrooms. He glanced at the king. So let me prove it. Give me a real fight. Let me face the enemy you fear. If I fail, I leave. But if I win, you follow me. No more doubts. No more objections. The court erupted into whispers. It was madness. Reckless and dangerous. And yet, King Xerath leaned forward, considering the offer. Silvera watched Galen with a mix of frustration and admiration. Adhira remained silent, studying the nobles. Velith tilted her head, intrigued by his boldness. Finally, the king spoke. Very well. His voice silenced the room. The Xaltor warlords have begun their attacks on the outer colonies. You will lead an army against them. If you return victorious, there will be no more debate. Galen nodded, feeling the weight of what he had just agreed to. This was no longer a test. This was war. And now, the fate of an empire rested in the hands of a single human. The warship Valkyran cut through the void of space like a spear, leading an armada of Silurian warships toward the Xaltor-occupied colony of Drexus IV. Galen Voss stood on the command deck, watching the holographic display of the battlefield unfold before him. Red markers represented enemy ships, surrounding the planet like vultures. The Silurian fleet outnumbered them, but the Xaltor were brutal warriors, known for their relentless assaults and disregard for losses. The high-ranking Silurian officers around him shifted uncomfortably. It was clear that many still doubted him. Commander Verith, a hardened soldier with deep scars along his silver skin, stepped forward. Our usual strategy would be a full frontal assault, overwhelm them with superior firepower. That's exactly what they expect. Galen said, shaking his head. And they want us to charge in. They'll drag us into a long, bloody battle, and even if we win, we'll take heavy losses. Varith frowned. Then what do you suggest, human? Galen smirked. We make them believe we're playing their game. Then we break it. The officers exchanged glances. Even the princesses, who stood near the edge of the deck, were watching him with interest. Silvera still looked skeptical. Syra remained unreadable, and Velith, as always, seemed entertained. Galen turned back to the display. We send a small force forward, a weak-looking one. We make them think we're hesitant, unorganized. When they charge to crush us, we hit them from the flanks, cutting off their retreat. Then we drop ground forces behind their lines, severing their command structure. Varith's brow furrowed. That's the dishonorable tactic. Galen's expression hardened. There's no honor in losing a war. Silence filled the room. Then King Zerith's voice echoed through the chamber. Do it. The officers obeyed. Orders were sent. Ships moved into position, and the trap was set. Minutes later, the battle began. The Silurian fleet's weak frontline force moved forward, engaging the Saltor ships. As expected, the enemy charged in full force, believing it to be an easy victory. But the moment they overextended, the real attack began. From the flanks, hidden Silurian cruisers emerged, blasting the Saltor fleet with devastating precision. In an instant, enemy formations collapsed. On the ground, Galen himself led an elite force, descending onto Drexis IV. The Saltor warriors were powerful, their crimson armor gleaming under the burning sky, but they were undisciplined, relying on brute strength. Galen used that against them, leading his soldiers through tight corridors, setting up ambushes, using explosives to create choke points. The battle raged for hours, but in the end, the Saltor forces were shattered. Their commanders fell, their fleet destroyed. Drexis IV belonged to the Silurians once more. As Galen stood on the ruined battlefield, blood and ash in the air, Silvera approached. Her silver eyes studied him differently now, not as an outsider, but as a warrior. You won, she admitted. Galen smirked. Told you I would. For the first time, she smiled. Back on the Valkyran, a transmission came through from the royal court. King Zerith's voice was firm. The debate is over. The human stays. Galen had proven himself, but he knew this was only the beginning. The halls of the Silurian royal palace were vast and shimmering, their crystalline walls reflecting the twin moons outside. Galen Voss walked through the corridors, feeling the weight of his victory settle over him like an iron cloak. He had won the battle of Drexis IV, proven himself in war, and earned the respect of the king. But not everyone was pleased. He could feel the stares as he passed. Noble lords and high-ranking commanders watched him with a mix of suspicion and resentment. Some whispered behind his back, others didn't bother hiding their disdain. They may follow you in battle, a voice said beside him, but many still want you gone. Galen turned to see Syra walking beside him, her violet eyes sharp as ever. Of all the princesses, she was the hardest to read. Silvera spoke with her blade, Velith with her curiosity, but Xyra, she played the long game. I expected that, Galen said. They don't like change. They fear it. Kyra corrected. And fear breeds treachery. Galen stopped walking. You're saying someone is planning something. Xyra glanced around, making sure they weren't being overheard. I've been watching the court. Some of the nobles believe you are dangerous. A few of them are plotting in the shadows. They won't challenge you openly, not yet, but they will act. Galen exhaled slowly. Of course, victory on the battlefield didn't mean safety in the palace. Before he could respond, a guard approached, bowing respectfully. The king summons you, Lord Voss. Galen nodded and followed the soldier, Syra beside him. They entered the great throne room where King Zerith sat, his expression unreadable. Silvera stood to the right, arms crossed, her gaze flickering with tension. Velith was on the left, quietly observing as always. At the base of the throne stood Lord Verith, the same noble who had opposed Galen from the start. "Your Majesty," Verith said, voice smooth and calm, "this human has proven himself in war, but war is not everything. He does not understand our ways. He is not fit to stand beside your daughters." Galen met his gaze evenly. "You still don't trust me." Verith smirked. "I trust that power corrupts. And you, a human, have been given far too much of it." He turned to the king. "We must be careful, my lord. A single victory does not mean he should be granted a future among us." The room was silent. Then the king spoke. "Trust is earned through actions, not words." His silver eyes locked onto Galen. "Tell me, human, if you were given true power here, if you were given a throne, what would you do?" Galen didn't hesitate. "I would protect this kingdom. Not because I want power, but because I believe in it. Your people think I'm an outsider. Fine. Then let me prove I can be more. Give me a place among them. Let me stand where I can make a difference." The king studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. But behind him, Lord Verith's hands tightened into fists. His eyes burned with quiet rage. The battle for the kingdom was far from over. Night had fallen over the Silurian capital, its towering spires glowing under the light of the twin moons. The air carried a cool breeze, but beneath the peaceful exterior, danger lurked in the shadows. Galen Voss sat in his chambers, studying the battle reports from Drexus IV. The war with the Exaltor wasn't over yet, and he needed to prepare for the next move. But something felt off. A strange silence filled the palace tonight. No distant chatter of guards, no soft hum of the energy barriers. Then he heard it, a whisper of movement, too light for normal footsteps. Without hesitation, Galen flipped the table and dove to the side, just as a dagger sliced through the air, where his throat had been a second before. The blade lodged into the wooden surface, and from the shadows, a cloaked figure emerged. An assassin. Galen didn't wait for an introduction. He grabbed the closest weapon, a ceremonial sword on the wall, and swung just in time to block another strike. Sparks flew as steel met steel. The assassin was fast, inhumanly so. A Silurian, no doubt, but not just any warrior. This one was highly trained. The assassin twisted, spinning low, aiming for his legs. Galen barely dodged, rolling backward. He reached for his sidearm, but the assassin kicked it away, lunging again. Galen fought on instinct, blocking and countering, but he was at a disadvantage. His enemy was stronger, faster. A single mistake would end him. Then a voice rang out from the doorway. Enough. A blast of energy shot across the room, forcing the assassin to leap away. Silvera stepped in, her blade drawn, eyes burning with fury. Behind her, Zyra and Velith entered, both looking equally tense. Guards followed, surrounding the room. The assassin froze, knowing escape was impossible. Slowly, they removed their hood. A woman with sharp silver eyes and a tattooed forehead glared at them. Velith tilted her head. Interesting. A member of the Shadow Creed, an ancient order of assassins, rarely seen. Silvera pointed her sword at the intruder. Who sent you? The assassin smirked. You already know. Galen did. There was only one person in the palace who wanted him dead this badly. Lord Verith. The guards seized the assassin, dragging her away, but Galen knew this was only the beginning. Assassins were not sent as simple threats. They were sent as final warnings. King Zerith arrived moments later, his face unreadable as he took in the wreckage of the room. It seems your presence has shaken the foundations of this court, he said. Galen exhaled, gripping his sword. Then it's time we stop pretending this is just a political dispute. This is a war, and I intend to win it. The king nodded. Then prepare yourself, human, because tomorrow, The court will decide who truly deserves the throne. Galen met his gaze. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for a future. The grand hall of the Silurian palace was filled with tension. Nobles, warriors, and scholars gathered, their eyes locked on the center of the chamber where Galen Voss stood. At the far end, King Zereth sat on his throne, his daughters beside him. Silvera stood tall, her arms crossed, ready for battle if necessary. Zyra observed everything in silence, calculating her next move. Velith, as always, looked amused, as if enjoying a game only she understood. Before them all stood Lord Verith, his face calm, but his eyes burning with quiet rage. He had failed to kill Galen in the shadows. Now he would try to destroy him in the light. "This human," Verith said, addressing the court, "has brought dishonor to our traditions. He has gained influence not through noble blood, but through trickery and brute force. Is this the future we want? A human leading our empire?" Murmurs of agreement spread through the room. Many still saw Galen as an outsider, but just as many had seen him fight, seen him win battles they could not. Galen stepped forward. "I never asked for your throne," he said, his voice steady. "I never asked for power, but I earned the right to stand here. I fought for this kingdom when others hesitated. I bled for it, and I will not let it be torn apart by men who fear change." Verith smirked. "Fine words, human, but words do not rule. Strength does." He turned to the king. "Your Majesty, I challenge him to the trial of kings." Gasps filled the hall. The trial of kings was an ancient Silurian custom, a duel to decide leadership when the court was divided, a battle to the death. King Zereth looked at Galen. "Do you accept?" Galen glanced at the princesses. Silvera's hands clenched into fists, but she nodded slightly. Zyra met his gaze with quiet approval. Velith just smiled. Galen turned back to the king. "I accept." The court moved to the arena of ancestry, an ancient battleground carved into the heart of the palace. Torches lit the circular stone floor, and above, thousands of Silurians gathered to watch. Galen stepped into the arena, facing Verith, who stood in gleaming battle armor, a long energy blade in his hands. "You should have left when you had the chance," Verith sneered. Galen smirked. "I was about to say the same thing." The battle began. Verith struck first, his blade a blur of deadly precision. Galen barely dodged, countering with his own sword. Sparks flew as steel clashed against steel. Verith was strong, his attacks fueled by rage and hatred. But Galen had fought worse. He had fought Xaltor warlords, assassins, and entire fleets. He fought with skill, not anger. Blow after blow, the fight raged. Verith grew reckless, furious that a human could match him. And that was his mistake. Galen feinted left, then twisted, slamming the hilt of his sword into Verith's ribs. The noble stumbled. In that moment of weakness, Galen struck, slicing his blade across Verith's chest. Verith fell to his knees, gasping, his pride shattered. The court was silent. King Zereth stood. "It is decided." Galen stepped back, catching his breath. He had won. The kingdom was his to protect.